for this wide-ranging festa of ideas over these 4 days. Our special guest tonight is Yossi Klein Halevi for the next 55 minutes. As his Twitter handle describes him, best-selling author whose latest book on the New York Times bestseller list is Letter to My Palestinian Neighbor, and his previous book, many of us read, Like Dreamers. He's now Senior Fellow at Jerusalem's Hartman Institute, where he co-directs a very interesting project called the Muslim Leadership Institute, where he teaches and interacts with emerging young Muslim leaders in the United States. Yossi will speak for 20 to 30 minutes about and focus on the Abraham Accords, and he'll be followed by an equal amount of questions and answers. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce one of Israel and the Jewish world's most engaging and becoming intellectuals, Yossi Klein Halevi. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Michael, and greetings from Jerusalem, everyone. There's a tendency in the international community. I'm hearing an echo. Do you hear that, Michael?
No, I don't. You're fine according to me.
Okay. So there's a tendency in the international community to downplay the significance of the Abraham Accords. This was captured in an editorial in the New York Times shortly after the Accords were signed, which noted that this isn't really a peace agreement because Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain never actually fought a war. And if you didn't fight an actual war, then you're not really making an actual peace. It seems to me that this is missing several crucial points about what the significance of the Abraham Accords really is. First of all, this is the first peace that is a genuine act of normalization between Israel and parts of the Arab world. We have, of course, we've signed agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, but those have been grudging expressions of peace in the most formalistic sense. The governments of Egypt and Jordan have never allowed their people to engage in normalization with Israelis. They've never allowed the peace to become organic and to grow. In this case, we are seeing a peace that is not only driven from the top, but also being driven by important sectors within the UAE and Bahrain, business sectors, certainly security interests. And we're seeing a spontaneous emergence of networks of relationships. And it's almost as if these two societies, Israel and the UAE, in some ways, the most successful countries in the Middle East, have been waiting for decades to actually discover each other. There is no holding back these two societies. The number of flights is continuing to be added. We have 3, 4, 5 flights a day between our countries. New initiatives are emerging seemingly every day. And so the first significance of this agreement is that it is a first real model. And I emphasize a model because I don't want to overstate the significance of what's been achieved, but I also don't want to minimize that significance. We now have a model in place for what regional peace could look like. The second point that I think the New York Times editorial missed is that while Israel and the Gulf states were never technically in a shooting war, we were very much in a state of active conflict for decades. One can go back to the winter of 1973, fall of 1974, to the Arab oil boycott, which effectively turned Israel into a pariah state in large parts of the world. In response to the Arab oil boycott, almost the entirety of the African continent severed relations with Israel. Western Europe turned pro-Palestinian not because it discovered the moral imperative of the Palestinian cause, but quite cynically in response to Arab oil pressure. The Zionism racism resolution that was voted on in 1975 at the UN was in some sense a direct consequence of the Arab oil boycott. And so Israel faced in the mid-1970s a weapon that we didn't really know how to contend with. The Arab oil boycott threatened to turn Israel into a diplomatic and economic pariah. And so while, yes, the Times is correct technically that we were never in a shooting war, the victory that I have to say that I feel as an Israeli, seeing the normalization between Israel and parts of the Arab world being driven by the Arab oil-producing countries is, to me, really an astonishing moment. And it is a testament to Israel's perseverance, to the economic and military power of Israel, which has really made this agreement possible. And it also confounds the assumptions of, frankly, the diplomatic community, which for years assumed that peace depends on first breaking the logjam between Israel and the Palestinians, and then the rest of the Arab world will fall into place. Today, we now are seeing what is probably the reverse, which is we're going to have a breakthrough with parts of the Arab world, and that could lay the groundwork for peace with Palestinians. And I'll get back to that point in a few moments. The possibility is being raised here, and there are some commentators in Israel who have really offered the tantalizing vision of an end to the Arab war against Israel. And I have also been guilty of that hyperbole, and I do think it's an exaggeration. I've noted the irony of the rise of the BDS movement to boycott Israel in the West, even as the Arab boycott of Israel is collapsing. There is certainly an irony for the West to internalize here. Nevertheless, I do think that it's premature to say that the Arab war against Israel is definitively over. And we saw evidence to the contrary just yesterday at a meeting, a regional meeting convened in Bahrain, a virtual meeting, in which Israel's foreign minister participated, Gabi Ashkenazi, and in which Saudi Prince Turki Al Faisal, the former Saudi ambassador to the US, reverted to the battle days of demonizing Israel, essentially comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, accusing Israel of having actual concentration camps for Palestinians, pulling out all the stops, all of the ugly, demonizing rhetoric that we were so accustomed to for decades, coming from Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Arab world, were back yesterday. Some Israeli commentators responded with a deep sense of depression, even a sense of betrayal. We thought that normalization was just around the corner, and here we have a prominent Saudi figure denouncing Israel in the most brutal rhetoric. I would argue, though, that something else is happening here, is that there is a quiet struggle going on behind the scenes within the Saudi royal family about how far to take normalization. Now, bear in mind that Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the Muslim world's holy places, and there is built into Saudi international relations an understandable caution. And what we're seeing playing out here is is a glimpse into the deep struggle that has really divided the Saudi royal family. And just last month, we heard an extraordinary speech by another former Saudi ambassador to the U.S., Prince Bandar, who went on a 45-minute rant against the Palestinian leadership and accused the Palestinian national movement of having rejected one peace offer after another, going back to 1947. It's the first time we've ever heard an Arab leader present the kind of indictment which I and Israeli have been offering for years. But now to hear that coming from a prominent Saudi leader was extraordinary. And so yesterday we saw the flip side of that. We saw a reversion to the demonization of Israel. But I would urge us all to have patience when it comes to the Saudi royal family. One needs to take a deep breath and see how this is going to play out. And the final point that I think is worth noting about yesterday's tantrum from Prince Turki Al Faisal was that he was denouncing Israel in the strongest possible terms, but doing so in the context of a regional meeting in which Israel's foreign minister was present. I think that is actually more significant than the fact that he denounced Israel. He allowed himself to appear publicly within a virtual framework, including Israel, as part of a regional conversation. And so my sense is that he was protecting himself, even as he was making one additional step forward toward normalization. Now, the UAE would never have gone as far as it did in normalizing with Israel without the tacit agreement, or maybe even the active agreement of the Saudis. And so we're seeing a dance playing out here. And again, I think we need to not take things at face value and know that there are deep processes at work. We do know that MBS very much wants to normalize relations with Israel, and the king does not. And so there is a power play going on that level as well.
Yossi, just to interrupt you for a second, MBS is the one who met with Netanyahu at that.
Yes, thank you.
The plane came in, yeah? Pompeo's plane.
Yes, thanks for that point. We've already had a secret, not secret meeting between Netanyahu and MBS, which was allowed to be leaked. There apparently have been other meetings in the past. They were never leaked. This one was leaked, initially confirmed by Saudi officials, and then denied. So again, that's part of the dance that's playing out. Now, another argument that's been raised to minimize the significance of the accords is that this is an attempt to circumvent the Palestinian issue. It is an attempt to essentially reward the Netanyahu policy of downplaying the significance of the Palestinian problem and of creating agreements with the Arab world that essentially lets Israel off the hook from dealing with the occupation. My sense is that it is quite different. I think that the Abraham Accords offers us potentially the best chance we've had in 2 decades or more to reach a breakthrough on the Palestinian front. Now, this is not going to happen anytime soon, and it's not going to happen directly. But if I could have 2 or 3 minutes to lay out my thesis here, and that is that at this moment, there is no hope whatsoever for a bilateral breakthrough between Israel and the Palestinians. Each side knows the other's red lines. We all know how far the other side is ready to go. We're not prepared to redivide Jerusalem. The Palestinian leadership is not prepared to fundamentally compromise on refugee return to the state of Israel. Both of those positions are deal breakers, and neither side is ready to move. Now, bear in mind that the key to a Palestinian state is held by the Israeli public. And Israelis today are deeply skeptical of the peaceful intentions of the Palestinian national movement. This cuts virtually across the political spectrum. Since the Second Intifada of the early 2000s, which followed the first time that Israel offered to create a Palestinian state, and in the Israeli narrative, our offer for peace was met by a counter-Palestinian offer of 4 years of the worst terrorism in Israel's history. Now, regardless of whether you accept this narrative or not, bear in mind that this is a narrative that is normative in Israel. Again, it cuts across from moderate left through the center, through moderate right to the hard right. Probably 80 to 90% of Israeli Jews believe deeply that we tried to make peace in the year 2000 and were met with the worst wave of terrorism in our history. That has fundamentally transformed Israeli politics and shifted everything to the right. So that the debate today, the Israeli political map today, and we see this playing out in one election after another over the last 2 years, is not between the Israeli left and right. There is no Israeli left anymore. It collapsed in the Second Intifada. It lost its credibility. Israelis stopped believing in the promises of a two-state solution with the Second Intifada. You now have an Israeli political map divided by right and center. And the center is not all that different in its wariness of Palestinian intentions than the Israeli right. And so the question is, how do you move the Israeli public forward? How do you get Israelis to begin to lower their guard and realize that the occupation is a disaster for Israel as well, which I deeply believe. I believe that a two-state solution is in my interest no less ultimately than in the interests of Palestinians. But how do you convince me as a skeptic of the peaceful intentions of the Palestinian leadership to begin shifting back toward a two-state paradigm? And here is where the Abraham Accords come into play. For 70 years, we in Israel were accustomed to living under siege. The more we have been under siege, the more hardline Israeli society has shifted. When Israelis feel embraced by the international community, we begin to lower our guard. And we saw that happening in 1993 with the Oslo process. The Oslo process was preceded by a tremendous diplomatic breakthrough for Israel. Dozens of countries recognized Israel with the fall of the Soviet Union. The entire former Soviet bloc established relations with Israel. All of Africa, with the fall of the Soviet Union, resumed diplomatic relations with Israel. The Zionism racism resolution was repealed at the UN, and Israelis began to feel that the international community was embracing us rather than treating us like a pariah. The result was the election of Yitzhak Rabin and the Oslo peace process. When Israelis feel that the siege is easing, we tend to lower our guard and begin to consider concessions. That, for me, is the real significance of the Abraham Accords, the psychological impact on Israel, that we are not besieged here. Because in order to understand the Israeli mindset, you have to think of a kind of a split screen in the Israeli head. One side of the screen is Israel versus the Palestinians. We are Goliath and the Palestinians are David. The other side of the screen is Israel and the Arab and Muslim worlds, and there the balance of power looks very different. So Israelis simultaneously feel powerful toward the Palestinians and vulnerable in the wider region. The more that the region embraces us, the more willing I believe Israelis are going to be to deal with the other side of the problem, which is Israel and the Palestinians. Here, I would say that we are dealing in a long-term process, but the first very hopeful sign that I saw, one of the first fruits of the Abraham Accords, was reflected in a poll taken of the Israeli public, where for the first time in many years, there were more Israelis in favor of a two-state solution than opposed. And I believe that that was a direct response to the Abraham Accords. The overwhelming majority of Israelis, something like 80%, preferred peace with the Gulf states to annexing parts of the West Bank. And you'll all remember that this past summer, we were in a tizzy about annexation. Netanyahu was going to annex 20 or 30% of the West Bank, and then suddenly annexation was removed from the table as soon as there was the possibility of peace with an Arab country. And I think that that's the paradigm we need to keep our focus on. Israelis do not respond well to international pressure, to boycotts, to demonization. The only pressure Israelis cannot resist is an embrace. And that, for me, is the real significance. That's the real significance of the Abraham Accords. Maybe a word, Michael, can I have another 2 or 3 minutes? And that's the significance of Iran in this emerging détente between Israel and the Sunni world. The true credit for peace between Israel and parts of the Arab world belongs to Iran. The Iranian threat, the fact that Iran now controls directly or indirectly 4 Arab countries and is threatening the entire Middle East, the fear of a resurgent imperial Iran has brought together this unexpected alliance. And as we enter into a new era in the US with the return of the Democrats to power, the great anxiety here in the Middle East is about the resurrection of the Iran deal. The Iran deal is perceived by Israelis and Arabs as no less than an existential threat. And I'll sum up the fatal flaw of the Iran deal in one line. The Iran deal, the trade-off of the Iran deal was that the Iranian regime agreed to restrain its nuclear ambitions, not to give them up, to restrain its ambitions, remaining on the nuclear threshold in exchange for temporarily restraining its nuclear ambitions, in exchange for an immediate international empowerment of the Iranian regime as the regional hegemony in the Arab world, as the conventional power in the Middle East. And so the trade-off really was an astonishing deal for Iran. Just wait 10 years, the sunset clauses are ticking. Within 10 years, you will still have virtually your whole nuclear infrastructure, including your military infrastructure, in place, your nuclear military infrastructure in place. The sunset clauses will kick in, the deal will lapse, and meanwhile, you will have emerged as the regional power thanks to all of the lucrative trade agreements with Europe and other countries and other parts of the world, and international legitimacy. And so from where we sit here in the Middle East, the naivete of the international community in endorsing this extraordinary deal really was the impetus for bringing Arabs and Israelis together. And my strong sense is that a return to the deal is going to be met by a very determined, united Arab-Israeli front, something that we did not see in 2015. This time around, Israel, the Emirates, perhaps even the Saudis, are going to be presenting a very vigorous counteroffensive against the renewal of the deal on its old terms. I believe we're going to need to present a counter deal, something that Israel failed to do in 2015, to our detriment. We're going to need to say, what is a deal that we can live with? And that's something that I believe Israel and the Gulf states need to put on the agenda as soon as possible. So why don't we open for conversation?
Well, that was a great point to end on, because you're host of this session is the person in Australia who fought that deal hardest and longest, because I thought that it would destabilise the Middle East. So a few days ago,
more power to you, Michael.
Well, I was a bit sugar. I even did a public billboard in my constituency against the foreign minister going over to Iran and making sweet with Khamenei. So anyhow, that's another story. But a few days ago, Yossi, the Saudis actually, to prove your point, issued a démarche to the new incoming Biden administration saying that, guys, listen, if you want to revive this JCPOA, you have to include us. And I wonder whether the Abraham Accords can work in a different way, that after Biden comes in on 20 January, that the Saudis can hold out, well, you can be a peacemaker too. We will agree with the Israelis, but don't, and have a peace agreement with them, and there can be a ceremony where Biden can be, as we say in Yiddish, a ganze Macher, sit there like Clinton did with Arafat and Rabin. And is that why you think the Saudis are holding out? And what will?
It's very interesting. It's very interesting. That's the first time that I've heard anyone raise that very tantalizing possibility, and I'm going to explore that a little bit more after this call. It's a very interesting scenario. There's a backstory, by the way, to the Saudi pronouncement a few days ago, which is that both Israel and the Sunni states felt betrayed by the Obama administration, which repeatedly assured its allies in the Middle East that there will be no secret deal with the Iranians, no back channel without the Israelis and the Arabs knowing about it. And as it turned out, that was not quite the truth. And in 2015, Israelis and Arabs felt doubly betrayed. We felt betrayed by the terms of the deal, but we also felt betrayed by the duplicitous way in which the deal had been negotiated.
Well, we in Australia felt betrayed by Secretary of State Kerry too, because he never paid any attention to this part of the world, because he was so interested in landing that Iranian deal that he paid no attention to the Chinese in the South China Sea. So there's a very deep grievance here about Americans focusing on the wrong parts of the world and the wrong deal for the wrong people. So I wonder if, Alan, you've got any questions that you want to sort of throw in there and tell us who they're from, so
Yes.
Yossi can take them up.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. I'll just ask one myself, if I can, of Yossi, and that was a terrific address. Thank you, Yossi. Will Egypt and Jordan, when they look at the nature of those normalisation deals with the UAE and Bahrain, might they change their tune a bit?
Good question.
Yeah, really good question. I think it'll be easier for Egypt than for Jordan. Jordan is 60% Palestinian. Jordan has to tread very carefully. Jordan is also a country dealing with an influx of several million refugees from Syria and Iraq. Jordan is, the stabilization of Jordan is not at all something to take for granted. Egypt is a more complicated story. The government there has, for decades, allowed or even encouraged the worst anti-Israel and even anti-Semitic propaganda to become endemic to the media culture, the educational system, and it's starting now to pull back from that. I'll give you an example of just how difficult it is. An Egyptian singer was caught posing with an Israeli singer. The two of them were vacationing in Abu Dhabi, and they took a photograph on Instagram. And the Egyptian singer became persona non grata when he returned to Cairo. They're threatening him with legal proceedings for fraternizing with an Israeli singer. And so that's the level of animus, that we're a level of irrational hatred that's so deeply ingrained in contemporary Egyptian culture.
What's the basis of that being illegal, given the fact that there's a peace treaty between the two countries? I mean, are there laws in Egypt that sort of prevent fraternization with Israelis?
There are laws. It's more on the level of the local trade associations or the cultural associations that will take punitive measures, and there are laws as well. Again, I don't know how specific they are, but there's a strong punitive system in Egypt that actively discourages Egyptians from visiting visiting Israel, for example, and that is illegal. So, which is astonishing. We're allowed to visit there, but they can't come here.
Alan, have you got some more?
Yep. Christopher Pine is asking whether, in the last 20 years, with the hardening of Israeli attitudes after the Second Intifada, was there a similar response amongst the Palestinians? And also, a second degree of that question is asking whether there is a movement for peace within the Palestinians that's observable. And I might just add to that, are there any young Palestinian leaders coming through who might be more reasonable to deal with in future decades?
Very important questions. There certainly has been a parallel hardening. I would call it a drift to despair among both Palestinians and Israelis. And the worrying irony here is that the younger you go in both societies, the more hard line. My generation of Israelis is still the generation that remembers the possibility, at least, of peace talks. My children's generation is the generation that grew up after the peace failed. They're the generation that believes we gave peace a chance, more than a chance, and it literally blew up in our faces. And on the Palestinian side, look, I'm sitting here now in my apartment. I live literally in the last row of houses in Jerusalem. The West Bank begins on the next hill, and there is a wall separating my porch from the Palestinian village on the next hill. Now that wall keeps Palestinians from crossing into Jerusalem. So we are living with this scar, this wound, as a constant part of our landscape. So the despair is a tangible expression. That wall also represents a collapse of relations, human relations between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, relations between Israelis and Palestinians were never great, but certainly in my generation, it was possible for Palestinians and Israelis to meet in all kinds of ways. There were no restrictions. Israelis traveled freely in Palestinian areas. Palestinians traveled freely in Tel Aviv. Everything was open, and everything now is closed. And so I had Palestinian friends. My kids don't. And that's true for both sides. And if you're asking about the emergence of reasonable Palestinian leaders, I don't see the emergence on either side right now of hopeful leaders, of leaders who can point us in a different direction.
But Yossi, poor old Mr. Abbas is 16 years into a 6-year term. He's over 80. He can't live forever. Who's the next figurehead that's likely to pop up? There's one person who's in jail who was considered a possible leader, but he is obviously out of it. What's going to happen? It could change overnight, surely.
Nobody knows. Really, nobody knows. Hamas, I'm sure, will make a power play. Hamas is really the force to watch here. You have a Palestinian Authority with very little legitimacy among its people, in part for the reason you just stated. There haven't been free elections in years, and this is widely seen as a corrupt and illegitimate regime. Hamas, of course, is a terrorist Islamist regime, but it does have more legitimacy. So we're dealing with these anomalies of Palestinian politics. And the question that I always ask Palestinians when I have the opportunity to engage is, why has Palestinian society only produced these two untenable options? Why is it only a corrupt Palestinian Authority versus a radical Islamist Hamas? Where's your third force? Where's the force representing the Palestinian middle class, the large numbers of Palestinians who want a normal life? And I know that they exist. I know them. And why hasn't that force managed to cohere politically? I don't have an answer. I haven't been given an answer.
Another question, please.
Yep. Michael Eason is asking this. The change in the dynamics of the Palestinian solution, might they be affected by the realignment of parts of the Arab alliance in the Knesset? And also, what effect maybe had on that just with the upcoming Israeli elections?
Well, it's a really important question because something very significant potentially is happening within Israeli society, and that is the mainstreaming of Arab politics. For various reasons, the Arab political parties have been persona non grata within the political system, having to do in part with the support for terrorism among some Arab Knesset members. Several Arab Knesset members in the past have supported Hezbollah and Hamas. And at the very least, as a bloc, the four Arab parties that have coalesced into the United Arab List have denied the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. And so an alliance bringing the Arab political parties into a coalition government has really been seen as a non-starter. I would say not only for the Jewish political parties, but for the Arab politicians themselves. The wariness has been true on both sides. We are starting to see a breakdown, finally, of this bifurcation of the Israeli political system. And thanks partly to Corona, by the way. I think that one of the blessings of Corona, if one can speak in that way, is that for the first time that I recall, the Arab-Israeli community is being celebrated in the Israeli media, in Israeli society, as an important part of the national effort to deal with an emergency. Corona is the first Israeli national emergency that has nothing to do with security, that has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli community is especially well positioned to deal with a health emergency because 20 to 25% of Israeli doctors are Arab, which is slightly higher than their percentage in Israeli society. 30% of Israeli nurses are Arab. 50% of Israeli pharmacists are Arab. And so they have had an integral role in the struggle against Corona, and their role has really been highlighted in the Israeli media. And so this, as a consequence, has softened the ground on both sides, within Arab society and in Jewish majority society. We're now looking at each other in a different way, and we're all wondering, can we really create a neutral civic space called Israeliness in which we can come together? It's a very loaded and very complicated space for all kinds of reasons. Nevertheless, I for the first time, I feel that there are possibilities here. And look, you had Blue and White trying, or at least exploring, the possibility of creating a coalition with Arab support. It was the first time we've ever seen something like that happen. And now Netanyahu has, in his Netanyahu way, his cynical Netanyahu way, is exploring an alliance with the Islamist faction within the United Arab List. And so what he has inadvertently done is brought us one significant step closer to allowing the center-left bloc to legitimize cooperation with the United Arab List. It's a very interesting moment.
Yossi, you need to be careful with the Abraham Accords and the ability of people to travel more easily to places in the Arab world. You might lose a lot of those highly educated pharmacists and doctors with higher salaries that they'll be willing to pay them, especially since they speak the language and are culturally sympathetic. So that's a danger I would point to. But I wanted to come back to your point about Israelis making peace when they're more confident and they're feeling that they're loved. What's happening in Israel with cultural soft power? Your film industry and TV series have made a breakthrough all over the Western world. It began with that Prisoner series that that morphed into Homeland. Fauda,
Yes.
I can't explain it, even though it's extremely violent, is very popular all over the world. We had Tehran, and now we've got Our Boys, which Prime Minister Netanyahu describes as anti-Semitic. But it's really managed to involve Israel in the Netflix world of the average person in the West. So it's made, the scenes of Tel Aviv, the attitudes of Israelis, the style of Israelis, the food of Israelis, together with, if you have both those series on Netflix and Emmanuel Ottolenghi, there's a real cultural change in attitudes towards Israel.
Yes, less so in the Middle East. The impact of Israeli TV, I think, has been limited in the Arab world. But what has made a major impact in the Arab and wider Muslim worlds is Israeli music. Now, Israeli music in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, has finally begun to reflect the ethnic diversity of the ingathering, what we call the ingathering of the exiles. The fact that Israel is actually not located somewhere between Luxembourg and France, but is a Middle Eastern country with a majority of its Jewish population coming from the Arab and Muslim worlds. Now, for the first two generations in Israel, we were dominated politically, culturally, by a secular, socialist, Ashkenazi European hegemony. And fortunately, that has now broken, not nearly as totally as I'd like to see, certainly in certain economic ways, but culturally, we have seen the victory from the bottom up of the richness of the diversity of Jewish culture. And Israeli music in particular is the carrier of the re-Easternization of Israel, of Israeli culture. And Israeli bands are wildly popular all over the Arab world. It's not a coincidence that that one of the very first Israelis to get on a plane to the Emirates after the signing of the Abraham Accords was Omer Adam, who was one of the great Israeli musicians who really represents a more Eastern turn of Israeli popular music, and is beloved not only in Israel but in the Arab world. We have a shared cultural language thanks to Israeli music with the Arab world now, and this is it's not only the musical sensibility, it's also the religious sensibility that much of this music is carrying. This is deeply spiritual music. Not all of it. Much of it is pop music and the routine themes of pop music, but much of the Easternization of Israeli music is bringing God and prayer back into Israeli popular culture, and that's giving us an additional shared language with the Arab world. And one of the ironies of the Israeli peace movement is that it was heavily Ashkenazi and heavily secular, and so it didn't have the language with which to speak to the Arab world. I believe that it's going to be religious Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Jews who have origins in the Arab and Muslim world, who are ultimately going to be the people who will establish those cultural and spiritual relations with our neighbors, which is going to bring us closer to peace.
Great, thank you. Alan, is there a couple of quick questions and a couple of quick answers we can get from Yossi before we conclude, or as we conclude?
Yes, in the debate that's taking place in the Saudi royal family between the king and MBS, is there any indication of who is winning? And given that it needed tacit Saudi agreement for the Abraham Accords, would that indicate that MBS has got his toe in front?
Look, until yesterday, I would have said unequivocally MBS has the upper hand. Yesterday's outburst from Prince Turki is a signal that this is not a done deal. And it's really, I certainly don't have the expertise to answer that question. I don't know who really does outside of the Saudi royal family. I don't know who's reading the tea leaves there.
Okay, Alan, and last one.
One last one. Earlier today, in an earlier session, Ehud Olmert said that as Prime Minister, he put on the table more than the Palestinians had ever been offered before with Mahmoud Abbas. And he said he spent more time negotiating with him than any other leader had before him, and still there could be no deal. Does Mahmoud Abbas want peace?
Yeah, absolutely, on Mahmoud Abbas's terms. and those terms include not just an Israeli return to the 67 borders and redividing Jerusalem, but substantial Israeli concessions on the return of the descendants of refugees from 1948, which is a non-starter for no matter who would be in power in Israel. If there's ever going to be a deal, the deal is that a Palestinian state absorbs the Palestinian diaspora. Whoever wants to return from the descendants of 1948 will go to a Palestinian state, not to the Jewish state. We're not going to negotiate our demographic suicide. Abbas understands that, and Abbas actually came closer than any Palestinian leader to offering a concession on right of return. And it happened, I believe it was 2012. He was interviewed on Israel TV, and he was asked, do you believe that you, as a refugee, a 1948 refugee, have the right to return to the town in which you were born in what is now Israel, which is Safed, Sfat in Hebrew? And Abbas said, I have the right to visit Safed, but Safed is the state of Israel. And that was an extraordinary moment. And when I heard him say that, I was galvanized. I felt, now we can really get somewhere. In the following days, there was such an outcry in Palestinian society that Abbas quickly walked it back and said, I was just speaking as an individual, and the right of return is sacred. Now, that was the moment when Abbas lost me forever. And I believe it was the moment when he let us know that he was not going to go the way of Rabin and Sadat. Not coincidentally, the only two genuine peacemakers we have had, and the two men who were assassinated. And Abbas made a very cold calculation. I'm not going there. I'm not going to force my people to recognize reality. I'm going to let the street determine my policy. And until we have a Palestinian leader and an Israeli leader who are ready to tell their people the truth, which is the status quo is not tenable for the long term. And we are two peoples that have to figure out how to live with each other, and two peoples that are both indigenous to this land, and we need to respect each other's presence here. Nothing substantive will move on that front. But meanwhile, around us, I see great possibilities for change.
Wonderful. Yossi, on that great note, your reputation preceded you. This really wonderful session has justified everything people have heard about you. And there's a great word in Yiddish, tachlis. So people should go out and buy both your books, well, two of your books, Letter to My Palestinian Neighbor and Like Dreamers. That's how you can follow up this wonderful session with Yossi Klein Halevi. Thank you so much from all of your friends in Australia and Britain and Israel.
So much appreciated, Michael. Thank you.
All the best.
Take care, everyone.